Well, this story is really a story that most of us in Canada were never taught. We were not taught it in our schools and growing up. And it is the story of what we did as a society and as a government to the First Peoples of Canada. What we did for almost 150 years was pass laws and policies that allowed us legally to round up Aboriginal children, to remove them from their homes and families and communities and everything that was familiar to them, and to place them in residential schools where they were away from everything familiar for weeks, sometimes months, and sometimes years at a time. There we had a primary goal, and it was to so-called civilize the so-called savages and to Christianize them and to do everything that we could so that over the course of time they would be fully assimilated into Canadian society and there would be what was deemed to be no more Indian problem. That's what we did, and we did it for decades and decades. The last residential schools in Canada closed in the 1990s, and throughout most of that time into the early 70s, the federal government contracted the churches to run the schools. Indeed, the first residential schools were set up and established by some of the Protestant and Catholic churches, many of them based in Quebec, who spread out across the country. And then these mission schools became eventually government-run schools and residences in the later 70s and 80s. And what we know now, thanks to the bravery and the courage of those little children who grew up to be adults and started speaking up about what had happened to them, is that those experiences not only were in and of themselves very traumatizing, but they happened in situations where the children were ripe for abuse in cases where there were any deviants in the midst. And so there was a tremendous amount of physical abuse. There was a far greater amount of sexual abuse than anybody ever knew when we started having this national conversation. And it has left devastating impacts in the communities and in families, because many of those learned behaviors are the very ones that those children brought into their own adulthood. And then as the courageous ones are able to say, they did the very same things to their children in many cases as had happened to them. And so we are in the midst now of a really compelling national conversation and national opportunity to say, we can't cling to our ignorance. It's true that most of us alive today had nothing to do with the schools and knew nothing about it. We're not taught about it. But it is also true that we live in the present and we are the ones who will be responsible for the future. So we are all invited to have this enormous and I think compelling conversation about who we really are as a country, who we really have been as a country, and who do we want to be as a country? How do we want to live up to the values that we claim about ourselves throughout the world? And how do we provide proper redress and build meaningful relationships between the First Peoples, the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and all the rest of us who have come from so many other parts of the world?
Canada's residential school system for Aboriginal children was an education system in name only for much of its existence. These residential schools were created for the purpose of separating Aboriginal children from their families in order to minimize and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture, the culture of the legally dominant Euro-Christian Canadian society. Older brothers were separated from younger brothers, older sisters were separated from younger sisters, and brothers and sisters were separated from each other. This film will explore the central themes presented in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, while examining the history and the legacy of residential schools in Canada. Most of the narration is taken word for word from the final report of the TRC, often cited on the screen. Later in the film, we will review the 94 calls to action proposed by the Commission and visit some locations where these calls have been heard and taken to heart. It is hoped that understanding the truth about the residential school system will lead to a new relationship between the descendants of settlers and the Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada. The schools were in existence for well over 100 years, some from before Confederation, but were primarily active from the enactment of the Indian Act in 1876 to 1996, when the last school closed. In 1996, the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples urged Canadians to begin a national process of reconciliation. Much of what the Royal Commission had to say has been ignored by government. A majority of its recommendations were never implemented. But the report and its findings opened people's eyes and changed the conversation about the reality for Aboriginal people in this country. The federal government has estimated that at least 150,000 First Nation, Métis, and Inuit students passed through the residential school system. That experience was hidden for most of Canada's history, until survivors of the system were finally able to find the strength, courage, and support to bring their experiences to light in several thousand court cases that ultimately led to the largest class action lawsuit in Canada's history.
Because up until that point, the response from the federal government to the burgeoning abuse claims was really worrisome to them, right? Because there were so many, and they were afraid that these claims would clog up the courts. So they needed something as an option, right? And they came up with the dialogue process, and that became the early dispute resolution process, and it wasn't working. Other than the dialogues that traveled from one end of the country to the other, were a godsend in the sense that people were finally able to talk about their experiences.
Chief Fontaine and Professor Kathleen Mahoney, a law professor from the University of Calgary, formed a team that, after extensive discussions with representatives of former students, the Assembly of First Nations and other Aboriginal organizations, the involved churches, and the federal government, presented a comprehensive report and action plan. This plan came into effect in September 2007 and captured the scope of the residential schools issue and proposed a viable way forward.
The report to the Assembly of First Nations, that was to me and my executive, contained all of the elements that then became part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, including, though it was never part of the legislation, was an apology.
Brave survivors, through the telling of their painful stories, have stripped white supremacy of its authority and legitimacy. The irresistibility of speaking truth to power is real. Today is not the result of a political game. Instead, it is something that shows the righteousness and importance of our struggle.
The Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, which came into effect September 19, 2007, established a multi-billion-dollar fund that has 5 components. The Common Experience Payment for former students of the residential schools. The Independent Assessment Process, where funds were allocated for an out-of-court process for resolving sexual and serious physical and psychological abuse claims. The Commemoration Fund, to support commemorative projects. Health and Healing Services, which provided funds to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, established in 1998, whose first chair was George Erasmus. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement provided compensation to students who attended 139 residential schools and residences shown here on this map of Canada. This map provides a graphic image of the extent of residential schools across Canada identified by yellow squares. Chief Fontaine elaborates on the TRC.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because we wanted this to live on in the minds of not just the survivors that lived the experience, but Canadians. And we met with great resistance to creating this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Assembly of First Nations negotiating team was the only plaintiff legal team that persisted and understood that we needed something like a TRC. That's because we knew that once the money was gone, whether it was 3 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion, the money would be gone and the story would disappear if we didn't have a TRC.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was a commission like no other. The commission spent 6 years traveling to all parts of Canada to hear from the Aboriginal people who had been taken from their families as children, forcibly if necessary, and placed for much of their childhoods in residential schools. Its mandate was twofold. First, to reveal to Canadians the complex truth about the history and the ongoing legacy of the church-run residential schools, and second, to guide and inspire a process of truth and healing leading towards reconciliation within Aboriginal families and between Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal communities, churches, governments, and Canadians generally. The three commissioners were Chairperson, the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, a member of the Ojibwe Nation and Manitoba's first Aboriginal judge, who brings his many years of commitment advocating for Aboriginal rights and expert knowledge of Aboriginal culture and the administration of justice. Justice Murray Sinclair has since been appointed to the Senate.
As our mandate says,
Dr. Marie Wilson, an award-winning journalist, educator, and broadcast executive with a wide breadth of experience working with Aboriginal, church, and political organizations. She also has a deep personal knowledge of the residential school legacy through her immediate family and community ties.
The residential school experience.
And Chief Wilton Littlechild, member of the Cree Nation and the first Treaty First Nations person to receive his law degree from the University of Alberta in 1976. Chief Littlechild served 2 terms as the North American representative to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Beginning in June 2008, the Commission heard from more than 6,000 witnesses, most of whom survived the experience of living in the schools as students. It held 7 4-day national events in Winnipeg, Inuvik, Halifax, Saskatoon, Montreal, Vancouver, and Edmonton. There were as many as 155,000 visits to these 7 national events, and over 9,000 survivors registered to attend them. The Commission also organized regional events in Victoria and Whitehorse and held 238 days of local hearings in 77 communities across Canada.
And I remember the first night, we were hauled into this big concrete building because we were raised in log houses or teepees, and we were right in this big concrete building, and so cold, and we were all gathered up, separated into different sizes of. There's junior girls, medium girls, and senior girls. Of course, we were in the junior girls, and they lined us all up, about 300 kids, to have a shower, ice cold shower, with no towel, and we all had to stand in line until the last student had finished her shower. We weren't given no towels, and we were hauled upstairs to the dorm, I guess, and all we had was we were issued some kind of nightgowns, and I don't think any child slept that night because everybody was crying. Oh, before they took us to the dorm, we had to stand in line, and they deloused us. They called it delousing us. They put some kind of stuff in our hair, and they cut all our hair off. That was the worst thing that ever happened to me, was cutting my hair.
One significant legacy of the Commission is the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation on the campus of the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. This teepee standing on the grounds of the National Centre bears the symbol of the Commission, the circle of 7 flames that represent the 7 sacred teachings: love, respect, courage, honesty, wisdom, humility, and truth.
Well, the teepee on the property is one of the 3 teepees that we had at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and those were teepees that we put up at each one of our national events, and they were very important focal points to make sure that we had, at the very least, a visual representation of what a traditional home looked like, at least from the prairie cultures here and some of the other cultures that use teepees. We can remember that this place we now call Canada was the home of Indigenous peoples for millennia. It still is the home of Indigenous peoples. But it was that very life within the home that was attacked, that the Canadian government systematically tried to sever that most sacred of all bonds between parents and children. They in fact tried to weaponize the children against their parents so that the children themselves became an agent of colonization and destruction of Indigenous languages and cultures. So that teepee represents, yes, a traditional gathering site, a place where you would sleep, but it also represents that fundamental sense of home, of togetherness, of community that's so critically important in understanding this work of reconciliation.
It is here that the video and audio records of nearly 7,000 survivors of residential schools and those affected by the schools reside. Rai Moran, who had been Director of Statement Gathering with the Commission, reflects on the fact that the word truth comes before reconciliation.
Well, the truth-telling component of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is incredibly vital because we have to understand what it is that we are reconciling. What has happened in this country is a very systematic, very long-standing abrogation or violation of Indigenous rights. Indigenous peoples have been denied their rightful place within the Canadian family, and that has been done very deliberately. So we have to ensure that Canadians understand the full extent of how poorly Indigenous peoples have been treated, how systematically their societies were deconstructed and devalued by Canadian society in order to understand what we are building towards. The Commission itself defined reconciliation as the establishment and maintenance of mutually respectful relationships. It's very important to remember that that establishing foundation is what needs to be created. It says that we don't have a respectful relationship. And in order to understand how much we've failed, we have to understand how disrespectfully Indigenous peoples have been treated.
Reconciliation will take some time. Healing is not just for Indigenous people. The Reverend Stan McKay, former moderator of the United Church and a residential school survivor, sees an obstacle to reconciliation in Canada.
Yes, I think the process of colonization, the concept of removing all that is Indian from the children, is part of a concept that one group is superior to the other. One group has wisdom and knowledge and goodness, and the other has nothing. I think that concept has not been addressed in Canada, even with the apologies. The apologies are for behavior and practices that people have carried out, but there has not been an acknowledgement that the ongoing process marks our society in a way that even though we change our language, our attitudes continue to be a problem. And so I would say that the majority of Canadians still function with the concept that Indigenous peoples need help, need healing, and we're fine, thank you. As long as that persists, I believe we'll move very, very slowly toward addressing the historic injustice and shaping a future that involves us all with some respect and some dignity.
It is important that all Canadians understand how traditional First Nations, Inuit, and Métis approaches to resolving conflict, repairing harm, and restoring relationships can inform the reconciliation process.
When you look at the settlement agreement, it is unique beyond anything that exists in Canada. It's underlined by Indigenous cultures. indigenous languages, indigenous spirituality, indigenous traditions, our laws, our system of government. And that is why our agreement is of such interest to so many people in different parts of the world. Because this was the first time that that the indigenous thought, indigenous thinking, indigenous spirituality, indigenous traditions prevailed over in a way that made it possible for 97% of the survivors who attended residential school to vote positively to settlement agreement. 97%.
Thank you very much for that playing of the first video. And it is important for coming after your first video series with respect to For the Soul and Land, Stolen Hearts. And obviously the work that was being commented on with Senator Murray Sinclair at the time, and our past chief for the AFM, Phil Fontaine, and just these sharings that they were able to do. And again, going now into video number 2. Thank you. Neglect.
For over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada.
So assimilation is, that policy of those colonizers who are essentially attempting to eradicate the Indigenous identity. So, there was through certain processes, it's a gentler way of eliminating Indigenous peoples. So instead of the outright attack on Indigenous peoples, that was some of those earlier phases where they, were actually giving smallpox blankets to communities in the hope that Indigenous peoples would just die out to make way for the settlers and the immigrants. It was a somewhat gentler and perhaps more insidious, because it was not a direct outright assault on and an attempt to exterminate Indigenous peoples, but it's an attempt to exterminate what makes us Indigenous. It's that attempt to eliminate the language and the culture by replacing that with the mainstream, with that European language and culture, and encouraging Indigenous peoples to assimilate into that colonizers' language and culture, into white ways, into Christian ways, encouraging Indigenous people to speak English, to behave in ways that they deemed more civilized, and wanting them to become assimilated in that way.
The establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element of this policy, which can best be described as cultural genocide.
It was a process in which our cultures as Indigenous peoples were denied, were condemned, where legal structures were put up to destroy our practices, where our spiritual objects were destroyed. Those were part of our culture. So in destroying those things and in making us subject to laws that prevented us from practicing, that is cultural genocide. It impacted our dignity and our identity. Who am I if I can't live out of the culture that has been given to me?
So what the residential schools did was create a structure that was in place to get rid of Indigenous ways of understanding the purpose of life and the Creator and what our broader values are as human beings and our connection to all of creation. And I mentioned that colonization is a structure, and in the structure of residential schools, you see this assimilative practice that is trying to get rid of the distinctive otherness of Indigenous peoples.
And here in Canada, and here in Turtle Island, the long-term implications of that process of colonization, that hundreds of years of efforts to replace the Indigenous identity with one deemed more acceptable by Europeans, with a Christian European identity, has unfortunately had a very lasting impact in our communities. It has led to policies of government which focus on the eradication of Indigenous identity, focusing on assimilation, both voluntary and involuntary, here in Canada specifically, which we know now has extremely negative impacts on not only individual Indigenous people, but on entire families, communities, and nations, as those traditional families break down. Our traditional social structures are being broken down by this deliberate attempt by church and state to replace with the Western cultural identities.
It was not until 1894 that the federal government put in place regulations relating to mandatory residential school attendance. With a warrant, one could enter, by force if need be, any house, building, or place named in the warrant and remove the child. Even without a warrant, Indian Affairs employees and constables had the authority to arrest a student in the act of escaping from a residential school and return the child to the school.
The grief that I carry is about separation, being separated from my mom and dad, my brothers and sisters, and it's also about the separation that my mother experienced back in the 1920s. Her dad, my grandfather, didn't tell her that if he didn't put her in residential school, he'd be put in jail. She thought that she was a throwaway, that she wasn't wanted anymore.
Well, I think when we look at the female experience, that, with the women being the center of the family, with the women as mothers, those were the ones who had those children torn from their arms. And the women being the first teachers, the teachers of that language and culture in our communities, that role of our women was taken away when our children were taken away. And, the families breaking down was because of that taking away of the role of our women. So the devastation of the residential school experience is very keenly felt by Indigenous women, because it was their role as mothers, as teachers to our children, that was most strongly impacted, and as the keepers of our nations.
In justifying the government's residential school policy, Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, told the House of Commons in 1883, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training in mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself, as the head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools, where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men."
The title of my book is "We Were Not the Savage," and the reason for the title of the book is simply put that the Mi'kmaq were a civilized people who treated their own people with respect and dignity, in opposition when you're looking at the civilization of England at that point in time. It was more based on terrorism when you're looking at history, have a look at European history, and at that point in time, the English, for instance, were still burning people at the stake, and chopping people's heads off and putting them on spikes that terrorized the population into submission. So when you're looking at the overall history of Europe, in particular in 1492, you're looking at people who were, I guess, practicing barbarity across the line. So when you look at the history of the Mi'kmaq, for instance, the Mi'kmaq were a very peaceful people. And also the indigenous people of the Americas weren't traveling around the world destroying civilizations and claiming the wealth of other people for their own.
The history of the residential schools can be best understood in the context of the relationship between the growth of global, European-based empires and the Christian churches. Starting in the 16th century, European states gained control of indigenous peoples' lands throughout the world. It was an era of mass migration. Millions of Europeans arrived as colonial settlers in nearly every part of the world. The Catholic papacy was already playing a role in directing and legitimizing colonialism prior to Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas in the 1490s, largely by granting Catholic kingdoms the right to colonize lands they discovered. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the first of 4 orders referred to as papal bulls that granted most of North and South America to Spain. These orders helped shape the political and legal arguments that have come to be referred to as the doctrine of discovery, which was used to justify the colonization of the Americas in the 16th century.
So the doctrine of discovery is an assumption that when Europeans arrive on the shores of North America, that it's empty, legally speaking. Even though people live there, they're so low on the scale of social organization that they don't have rights to land or they don't have governance abilities. So the doctrine of discovery makes the assumption, because they're low on the scale of civilization, that when Europeans come along, immediately their law applies and their governance structures apply.
And this is a common trope. European explorers use this all throughout the 16th, 17th centuries as they turn up in new places, often holding some sort of ceremony, erecting crosses or pillars, often speaking sort of publicly to indigenous peoples who gather, who very clearly do not understand what is being said or the symbolism of the moment. And under sort of European law at the time, this meant that then the crowns, or the people who are claiming the lands for a particular European crown, could essentially have jurisdiction over the lands.
The doctrine of discovery was linked to a second idea. The lands being claimed were terra nullius, no man's land, and therefore open to claim. Under this doctrine, imperialists could argue that the presence of indigenous people did not void a claim of terra nullius, since the indigenous people simply occupied, rather than owned, the land. True ownership, they claimed, could come only with European-style agriculture.
This idea of the doctrine of discovery is often talked about as being terra nullius, which is regarding the land as being empty through these structures of law that don't recognize the prior inhabitants. But legally speaking, the assumption is that no one lives here. They don't have the same rights as Europeans who arrive on the shore. So by planting a flag, say, on a shore, that immediately transforms the relationships that the original peoples have and dispossesses them of the soil, dispossesses them of their government, because, again, they're regarded as being inferior, and that allows, again, Western European law to override the prior laws, the prior governance structures of the people who were living here.
In 1763, having won the 7 Years' War, Britain signed the Treaty of Paris, which ceded much of France's North American possessions to Britain, represented on this map in yellow. King George III then issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which established new protocols in Britain's relations with the First Nations people in North America. The Royal Proclamation recognized the rights of First Nations in these words: that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected, and who live under our protection, should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved for them, or any of them, as their hunting grounds. Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of the Indian Department, proceeded to invite some 22 First Nations to meet at Niagara in 1764 to renew and rebuild the relationship between the Crown and First Nations. The result of this Niagara gathering was the Treaty of Niagara, where over 2,000 representatives of 22 First Nations gathered with Johnson and established the treaty, which has been described as the touchstone of all subsequent treaties.
Treaties have always been significant to Indigenous peoples because it allows them to enter into a relationship of peace, friendship, and respect. They first did that with the natural world around them, then they did that with the nations that surrounded them, and when the Crown came along, they invited the Crown to enter into relations that Indigenous peoples were familiar with that create agreements as to how to live peacefully. The Royal Proclamation set out that we would live together in peace and friendship and respect, that we wouldn't molest or disturb one another. The Treaty of Niagara of 1764 set out that we would engage with one another on a nation-to-nation relationship by hearing what people had to say and incorporating that into our law. The treaties from the 1760s forward were about the spirit and intent of that initial agreement, which is to live together with understanding that people were here prior to Europeans, that it was their land and couldn't be taken unless it was agreed to through a process of negotiation between the parties. There were times that these treaties weren't upheld. There were no treaties between 1930 and 1975, but beginning in 1982, the courts have come along and said that treaties are intersocietal agreements that have to be given the highest possible respect, because if a Crown official acts contrary to those laws, they're acting contrary to Canadian law more generally. So it is Canadian law to recognize the high nature of treaties and their aspirations towards participatory, democratic engagement, rather than assuming that people are inferior or lower on the scale of social organization, that their lands just could be taken because they were discovered by some higher, superior European power.
The treaties are really significant when they're understood properly and when they're understood in the right context. A lot of people see them as something like as an agreement that First Nations people that sign the treaties are going to get something and give up the land. When really, when you look at the language in the treaties and the signing ceremonies and all the protocols that went along with agreeing to the treaties, it's about building a relationship, which if we honor the treaty, then we honor that relationship. We're reconciling that ally Indigenous relationship. So it's all, when I talk about reconciliation, it's all connected back to that relationship building that was first started when we signed the treaties.
Professor Burrows explains the significance of the wampum belt, an Indigenous record of a treaty celebrated in seashells sewn artfully to hide.
Well, when it comes to dealing with the Crown, they then took their own treaty traditions and they made them alive with European people as well. This is what the Iroquois did first with the Dutch in the 1640s and 50s in New York State. And then this agreement was eventually extended and entered into with the British. And then at the Treaty of Niagara, you have the further extension, as after the people who were allied with the French and the war happened, they also aligned with the British. This is called the Kasuenta by the Haudenosaunee And it represents that, again, the parties are going to live together in peace and in friendship and respect. You can see white being the dominant motif in the belt. And that peace and friendship and respect is reinforced because it's there 3 times each time the white is reproduced. But on the belt, you also have these 2 purple rows that represents the nation-to-nation relationship between the Indigenous party and the Crown. And they represent rivers of life. So you have the Crown and its rivers of life sailing its ship of state, controlling its own affairs. And then you have Indigenous peoples in their canoes on their rivers of life, controlling their own affairs. And so you have here a parallelism, recognizing that the Indigenous peoples have a right to governance in this territory. The Crown has some rights to this area as well, and that there, with this parallelism or this nation-to-nation relationship, that there should be no interference with one another in that.
In at least 4 places in the report, the authors declare that we as Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians are all treaty people. Based on the Treaty of Niagara in 1764 and subsequent treaties, Canadians need to see treaties not as one-time land transactions, but as agreements to live together to share this land.
And since these treaties have never been abrogated, they've never been annulled, they're still in some sense in force. The notion of we are all treaty people means that we are all beholden to these ideas. And of course, this is speaking back to a long history of particularly Europeans and Euro-Canadians treating treaties as land sales effectively. And this take that we are all treaty people says, actually, these are not final sales at all. There's not a moment where the relationship, this isn't a moment where the relationship ceases to exist. Like it would be if you bought a piece of land that had nothing to do with a treaty. Here what you get is, this is in effect an affirmation that a relationship exists and will continue to exist. And so therefore we are all required to, we are in a relationship whether we like it or not. So Senator Sinclair's reminder that we are all treaty people, to my mind, is a reminder that we have, relationships that we have to respect and work to make functional and positive and healthy.
Miigwech, thank you very much for being able to play that second part in that second video series, and just to look at and just remember in regards to that, we looked at different areas during that